All right, chapter 3 is all about quadratics, which are graphs of parabolas and when you've got squares. So you kind of have to work this whole chapter with quadratics. So one of the questions I wanted to focus on was using square roots to solve a quadratic. So if it looks like this and you've already got your x squared, instead of foiling everything out and trying to use quadratic formula or factor, what you can do is get the squared term by itself. So I'm going to divide by 3. So I get x minus 2 squared is equal to 6. So now to undo this square, as long as I've got that square by itself, to undo that square, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Remembering over here, I have to take plus or minus. I have to get my two solutions. So this gives me x minus 2, because I'm just undoing the square, equals plus or minus radical 6. And now to solve for x, all I need to do is add 2 to both sides. So I get x equals a positive 2 plus or minus the square root of 6. All I did was I added 2. These are not like terms. I can't put them together. So all I can do is leave it like that, which just looks like something similar you would get if you use quadratic formula. All right, so let's try the second one. So here is my square term right here. So I want to get that by itself. So I would subtract 12, divide by 4. I get x squared equals negative 3. So again, I take the square root of both sides, plus or minus on the right side. So I get x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 3. And you learned about imaginary numbers that becomes an imaginary number. So I can think of that as the square root of negative 1, which is I times the square root of 3. So you always want to bring out the square root of that negative 1, and you write it as I. So when you're trying to solve those, again, the easiest way to do them is to get the squared term by itself, take the square root of both sides, don't forget that you have to do plus or minus, and then you just solve for x. Okay, the next one I want to focus on is making sure you knew the quadratic formula, so that's down here. Remember, before you can use the quadratic formula, you have to make sure that you have it set equal to 0. So this one already is set equal to 0. This one is not. So let's maybe just focus on this one. So in order to do this one, I would add 4. So anytime you're solving, you have to get that set equal to 0. Now you've got your a is 3, your coefficient of x is b, so that's negative 1, and c is 4. So make sure you know what your a, b, and c are, then use the quadratic formula. It's the opposite of b, so it's a positive 1, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 1 squared is 1, minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. All right, now we need to do the arithmetic, and again, this is non-calculator, so you have to do this without your calculator. I would definitely do what's under there first. So 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 4 is 48. So I need to take 1 minus 48. That would be a negative 47. And down here I need to take 2 times 3 and get 6. Again, I'm dealing with a negative radical, so I can write that as 1 plus or minus I square root 47 all over 6. All right. If you did this one, I'm sure you could check your answer with your teacher, but you should have gotten 3 plus or minus. When you take b squared minus 4 times a times c, you should have gotten 5 all over 2. So that's the answer you should have gotten for that one if you try that one. Okay? All right. Next side deals with the I terms. So a couple things. First of all, we need to make sure you know how to simplify radicals. So when you have any radical and you need to simplify it, you need to break it up into a perfect square. So you think of all the perfect squares. Perfect squares are like 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25. I want any of these perfect squares that go into 50 evenly, so I see it's 25. So I'm going to break that up into the square root of 25 times the square root of 2. That still gives me the square root of 50, but now I can simplify the square root of 25 is 5. So 5 square root 2. You do the same thing even if there's imaginaries, so you have the square root of a negative. So again, I would break this up and say that's -2. I'm going to bring out the I, square root of -1 is I, times the square root of 20. So first I just brought out the I. Now I need to think of a perfect square in my list that goes into 20 evenly, which would be 4. So I have -2 times I times the square root of 4, times the square root of 5. So now the square root of 4 can be simplified, which is 2. 2 times -2 is -4, I square root 5. So that's just kind of making sure you can simplify radicals. Okay, so then with the I terms, when they're already in terms of I, being able to add, subtract, multiply. So adding and subtracting is easy. You're just adding like terms. You just have to be careful with subtracting that you're subtracting everything that's in the parentheses. So for the real part, I'm going to take 2 minus 3. That's -1. For the I part, I have an I minus a -7I. So when I subtract a negative, it's like adding. So I plus 7I is 8I. And that's all you do. You're just adding like terms. Multiplying is similar to that. You distribute. You're going to FOIL things out. So 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times -I, -2I. 5I times 3, 15I. 5I times -I is -5I squared. Okay, so you're just multiplying, distributing the 2, and then you distribute the 5. Now, the only other thing you have to do is, these are like terms, they're both I terms. You also have to realize that I squared is -1. So this really becomes 6. I add these together, I get 13I. But now I have a -5 times a -1. So -5 times -1 is +5, plus the 6 over here is 11 plus 13I. So FOIL everything out. You've got some like terms here, and realize that I squared is -1. And you do the same thing if it is a binomial square, because remember, you can't just square each of these individual terms. You have to think of it as 5 minus 2I times 5 minus 2I. So now you FOIL things out again. 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times -2I is -10I. -2I times 5, -10I. -2I times -2I is a positive 4I squared. My I terms are there, like terms. This is -1, so 4 times -1 is -4. So 25 minus 4 is 21 minus 20I. So just remember that I squared is -1. All right, I think I'll stop there, and then I'll come back and start with the calculator part on the next video.